Greetings and welcome to Artsy. I'm your host, Andrew Norris. Thank you for being here. This week's episode, I have Evan SkyTree Snyder as my guest. Evan is a music producer, a synthesizer technician, and he works as an engineer as well. This episode, we get into a unique take on synthesis that Evan has, where he's using things like crystals to send electrical signal through a synth. He calls it Geosonification. I think that's a great name, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. I'm going to keep this intro short and sweet. Don't want to give too much away, but definitely do yourself a favor. Go check out Evan on Bandcamp first and foremost. That's skytree.bandcamp.com, where you'll find his newest album called Infraplanetary. It features Aerothyme on a track, Jackson Whalen doing some rapping, and it's really good. I think you'll like it. No new patrons to announce this week. I'm recording this on Monday the 13th, exactly a week before this episode will drop. I am going out of town to visit family on Thursday the 16th. So if you do happen to subscribe in between now and when this episode drops a week from now, I will get you and shout you out on the episode that will drop on the 27th. But if you would like, you should head on over to patreon.com/RTAF and check it out. Got 3 tiers available. $4, $8, and $16 a month are your options at this point. You get video, you get shouts out, you get guest suggestions, you get merchandise, depending on what tier you subscribe to. And those compound the higher it gets. So go over, check it out. If you believe in what I'm doing here and you want to support it, if you want to encourage this project of tracing out the contours of the art world, head on over there and check it out. Anyway, so much for a short intro, huh? Let's get right into it. Mr. Evan SkyTree Snyder. Yeah, I'll just hit record. Say hey. There we go. There we go. Set the vibes. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll give you a little introduction.
Sure. Yeah.
My guest today. I've never really done this with the guests, like sitting right here.
I'm rarely introduced. So
My guest today is Evan SkyTree Snyder. And Evan is an engineer, a musician, producer, and I don't know, what would you call it, like earth modular synthesizer?
Man, I don't know if there is a term for that yet. I've been calling it geosonification.
Oh, okay.
So data sonification is kind of the process of taking data sets and ascribing means of translating that to audio, sometimes for fun, sometimes because it's helpful to evaluate the data in auditory format. But there's a lot of different types of sonification. Geosonification is just a soft term that I'm using to describe what I've been doing recently, especially during COVID. Up. Yeah, I did. So I don't expect any sort of like gravitas or significance from the term, but if we already use one, I suppose it kind of works.
That's yeah. I mean, it's a perfect term, and essentially, what I see and hear you doing is you're taking kind of like things from the earth, like crystals, running water, correct?
Yeah,
that's correct, right?
Yeah. So running water kind of goes outside that geo terminology, but it's still in the.
But it's that part of the larger geo, the.
True, which is why I'm not like discarding this pseudo term so quickly. It does fit a lot, especially the things that I'm thinking about doing in the years to come. It still will be fairly appropriate.
And you're basically taking nodes or like electrical. What would you call those? Like the things that you're attaching to get the data to send through.
Well, so I'm mostly using Eurorack modules,
Okay.
which has been really helpful because a lot of the things I've been doing over the past year and a half, through COVID especially, have been ideas that I've had brewing for a long time.
Uh-huh.
And as soon as I started to get into Modular, which is partially the fault of my good friend Bobby Eurothyme, who also got a bunch of his modules from Evan Bluetech.
Nice.
So I kind of could point to them as sort of that initial touch point of Modular. I've been peripherally familiar with it and, used synthesizers for a good 20 plus years. But once I started to dive into what the vast range of all these, especially like boutique modules are, I realized that like I can start to prove out ideas that were very esoteric for a very long time with off-the-shelf components. So it's one of my favorite things is when I can find like a product that already exists that can be used in a way that maybe the manufacturers didn't intend, but it lowers the barrier for entry so that the work itself can be past that initial catalyst point. And that is something that not only affects my approach to synthesis, but also to art and creativity in general quite a bit, is I just want to like get in there as smoothly and quickly as I can, and then the workload or the playground is past that door. Like you've opened the gate and walked through,
Right.
and then
there's no guards at the door.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
of these metaphors.
So in this case, it like not only provided me with a means of opening that gate and getting in really quickly, but has been almost bafflingly successful in terms of actually doing the things that I wanted to. I've been able to pull them off in the past year and a half, so it's felt a little uncanny.
Yeah.
Like there might be some kind of deal that I made with some entity that has something maybe more nefarious in mind, because it just keeps working, so I'm wondering when my luck is going to run out on this. But
Yeah.
I think in part, though, just to be more realistic about it, because that's a pretty paranoid take on it,
Yeah.
is that like I did think about this stuff for a long time in advance. And as
Right.
soon as I noticed the components out there existed, the actual ideas clicked together much more quickly.
Nice.
Yeah.
Let's kind of backtrack and give some context to everything that you just said. To kind of finish the picture I was trying to paint in the beginning, which is very basic. You're using crystals, let's just say crystals, as like the electrical signal to send through your modular synthesizers, which if someone's just hopping into this episode, and we have a lot of artists, like visual artists listening, so I don't necessarily expect everyone to know what modular synthesis is, although I don't want to insult their intelligence either.
I think a lot of people, as soon as you sit them down, like even kids, like to play around and twiddle knobs and start plugging things into each other. Like even
Right.
if you don't understand necessarily the specifics, it's intuitively accessible synthesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're basically running an electrical signal through and then modulating that.
Yeah.
At the very most basic explanation of what's going on there.
Sure. I mean, for quartz crystals, that's the case. There's several different methods that have sort of gotten built up over time, and so I'm just using the terminology like novel input source, basically.
Nice.
So in the case of quartz, using raw crystal points as piezoelectric pickups and filters, which I, up until giving it a shot, didn't know for sure if it was possible, because piezoelectric wafers that we use now in piezo pickups and like quartz resonators and things like that are very specifically cut. So it's like very thin layers at specific like micron depths. You have to cut at the exact right angle of the quartz like crystal matrix, and it's developed, quite a bit in the 100+ years since piezoelectricity was discovered by the Curie brothers at the turn of the century, last century.
So is that any relation to Marie Curie?
Yeah, actually.
Okay.
So Marie Curie was married to one of the Curie brothers.
Gotcha.
So they discovered piezoelectricity. She's, effectively the discoverer of radioactivity.
Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, they were definitely a power couple in the scientific community, but like things got proven out so quickly that like a lot of the early research is, as far as I've been able to discern, not readily available, or I'm not even sure if it exists anymore. They had to have, I would imagine, start with just crystal points, before we started understanding how we're going to actually mill them down and get like these little specific wafers.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find anything on the internet saying the piezoelectric effect will actually work in some functional way on a raw piece, and I was really curious to see if it would.
Yeah.
You would think over like 100 years we would go in these up and down cycles, but it's just been like linear or even exponential progression of technological specificity and component requirements and use cases and all that stuff. And so the very base fundamental concept has been lost to time if it was proven out at all, which it probably was.
Yeah.
So when I first sat down to give it a shot, I was really delighted, not necessarily surprised, but just like almost euphorically elated to see that it works. With not every quartz point, but most actually. And not even like specific faces. Like you get a slightly better effect on certain faces, but basically what I was doing is taking copper tape, which is basically flattened copper with adhesive on one side, and like cutting it to the size of the faces of the crystal points, and then it's like sticking it on there, using those as my electrodes, and then putting them on a what's kind of a speaker without a cone, which is just a transducer, and then vibrating the crystals. Okay. So I can send whatever signal I want into the transducer and amplify it, and then it'll vibrate the crystal, and I can actually get output from the electrodes, which when I first proved it out was like almost bizarre to hear. I was tapping on it with a singing bowl mallet, and I could hear the tapping when I put my headphones on and connected them to the electrodes. And at first I was like, okay, this is spooky. Maybe I'm just hearing the background sound of me doing this. So I ran it into an oscilloscope. I could see the signal, then ran it into Ableton, recorded it, and I could play it back. And it's been a matter of also like reducing the line noise or the ground noise in the signal, but it works. It was like hearing a spirit from inside the rock. To go definitely not
super esoteric.
Super esoteric,
very, that's
magic.
I was thinking that while you were talking about this. I'm thinking like any book that hears this, they're going to be like, aha, I told you.
I knew
crystals do have power, and and so that's, I kind of am wondering your take on that. I've always thought that, there's something there. I don't know if we can ascribe like these miraculous healing properties to crystals.
Right. Yeah. So like part of how I got into this subject matter, especially in the festival scene, is I think I did maybe a half dozen talks, like sort of sit down conversations in tandem with being booked for a music performance. And the second time around, I thought of all the subjects that I'd really like to discuss in this context and in this community is the physical properties of crystals and minerals that otherwise seem to be magic but are very real, very physical.
Right.
Many of them highly leveraged in our technology.
Right. Like computers and phones. Have little quartz.
Some of it just in our pockets at all times, So it's a really relatable thing, even if people don't necessarily. I shouldn't say that generally. Even if not everybody is aware of what that's doing, I don't expect that they need to necessarily.
Yeah.
But once you start to peel back the mystery on that a little bit, it's not like the Wizard of Oz where you just see like this guy back there,
Yeah.
It's like you're peeling back one seemingly immensely magical, mystical thing to find something else that, in my opinion, is equally inspirational and equally like delighting and existentially gratifying.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like in religion, our world religions in general, keeping things pretty earth-centric, but then as you go out into the cosmos, like it gets even more miraculous and amazing.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily find myself at odds often with the perspective of there being something grand to existence,
Right.
of there being something miraculous to just being alive. But I find an inspiration more by looking up through a telescope than by reading a book that was written several thousand years ago, as interesting as those are as like artifacts of human culture and development.
Right. Isn't there's a quote that goes something like, and I don't know who said it at all, maybe you'll recognize it, but it goes something like, any sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah, it's Arthur C. Clarke. He's
awesome.
Like one of my favorite sci-fi authors, and actually, I think science fiction in general is a really pretty broad and relatable expression of this phenomenology.
Yeah.
So I adore a lot of sci-fi, especially Arthur
Favorite
Clarke.
sci-fi movie
Favorite
or show?
Ooh. That's a hard call. I mean, Dune was exceptional. Really glad to see that brought to the big screen in a proper fashion.
So good.
No hate to David Lynch. Like that was
no shade.
Yeah, that was
no shade, David.
No shade at all.
I know you're listening right now.
Yeah. I think he would throw more shade on himself for that one than we ever would.
Well, so what I've heard in relation to that, not to get too off topic right away, but is that the original was 4.5 hours long, and they made him cut it down to like an hour and 45 or something like that.
Yeah.
And you can really tell in the second half of that Lynch movie that like they're just like cramming, like compressing everything.
Yeah.
But yes, this new Dune is so good.
Phenomenal. I mean, I'm admittedly a pretty hardcore Star Wars fan, and when I saw Dune, I walked out of the theater and reflected on my love of Star Wars as more of the proper context for what it is, which is like my nostalgic childhood love of science fiction from like an entry standpoint, you know. There's so much more to be explored still. Like I'm waiting for a sci-fi movie with like no humans. That surely can be done. It turns out people generally prefer to see other people in their entertainment, and right now if we were talking in some random alien language, we probably wouldn't have that many people listening.
Wouldn't have an audience here on Earth.
We might have one guy somewhere on mushrooms who was just like really excited about whatever, you know, glossolalia was coming out of our mouths, but like I think a lot of the science fiction that I would love to see doesn't yet exist, but then there are these glimmers of cultural acceptance and cultural expansion, like the new Dune movie.
Yeah.
Of course, like going back to Blade Runner, you know, the new 2049 as well as the previous Blade Runner. I love really not necessarily only hard sci-fi, but really immersive, transportational experiences in science fiction that recontextualize your understanding of your own society. Or yeah, exactly. And so it's sort of the comparison and the reconfiguration of things that we otherwise get in sort of static mindsets about with respect to our worldview. It 100%. Can throw wrenches into those things. So that's part of what I love about science fiction, and also the potential for hard sci-fi to really explore technological advancements that haven't yet occurred, or to recontextualize ones that have in a way that reaches people differently. So when I heard the quartz crystal tapping back through the electrode output, it felt like kind of a science fiction moment, you know, but a hard sci-fi. Like it's a real thing, it's a real phenomena, but it had that same sense of like awe and wonder that I have in watching Blade Runner 2049.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to how, like, and we can go as far back as you want, but like, how did these two kind of avenues of hard science and creativity come together for you? And if you could just maybe give us some life context.
Sure.
About all that.
Yeah, so just full disclosure, when I was pretty young, I think I was maybe 11 or 12, and this is kind of an explanation of my entry point to crystals as a phenomena or as a mineralogical, geological field to explore.
Mm-hmm.
I started off on the very esoteric side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So when I was 11 or 12, I got really bad pneumonia case and was out of school for months. Like every so often I get like a pile of letters from the kids at school because like I didn't see them.
Right.
And this is back when that was quite unusual. You know, these days people have to attend class from home and stuff, but
right, yeah.
It was a very lonely experience for several months to be just basically laid up. And my parents took me to several doctors, and they couldn't find a ready solution. There was no like prescription that could be thrown at me that was going to make me better, because they kept trying and nothing was working.
Yeah.
And my condition was worsening, to the point where I guess one doctor, well into this several months, told my parents that I would either get better or I wouldn't. So it was not a death sentence or anything, but it was like potentially a terminal case of pneumonia.
Yeah.
And I was like hallucinating towards the end of it.
Wow.
Like, I would have a hard time sitting up because I would feel like I was doing backflips. I would like have the trippiest dreams. At one point, I completely had I guess what in the adult context I call a bad trip, where I felt like I fully was brought to the forefront of infinity and had to like accept it for a second, but it was painfully disorienting and monstrous and impossible to grok, you know?
Yeah.
But I felt it, and it was a really powerful psychedelic moment as a kid brought on by pneumonia. But because my mom had exhausted all options up until that point, medically, she was interested in crystal healing and had this little green tourmaline, and put it in a little medicine pouch and told me to wear it. And I got better within 2 weeks.
Really?
Completely. Yeah.
Crazy.
And I remember like pulling that out of the pouch and looking at it and feeling inspired by the glitter of light passing through the tourmaline matrix.
Yeah.
And just feeling like I was holding a little piece of magic. And now looking back on it, I would say it's much more likely from a rational standpoint that it was placebo, which of course can have a very powerful effect.
Right,
especially,
yeah.
I don't know if there's any research on this. I'd be interested to know if there's any like paper written in child psychology journals that maybe details that perhaps children are more susceptible to placebo effects because of the suggestibility that kids tend to have.
Right.
I was highly suggestible, and of course trusted my mom implicitly out of all people. Her and my dad, like 100% would buy into what they told me to do.
Yeah.
And my mom, I think, had the conscience to deliver this as if it was something that could work instead of saying, oh, this might, we don't know for sure. I think she wanted to instill on me perhaps some measure of like placebo benefit.
Have you ever talked to her about that afterwards? Have you?
Yeah. Unfortunately, my mom passed away about 10 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, life, is precious. And I think I did get the opportunity to discuss it with her a couple times. And at one point she mentioned, well, I didn't know if this was going to work, but I figured I might as well try, like do anything at that point.
Yeah, totally.
She would, if I was being attacked by a bear, she'd tackle the bear.
Of course, yeah.
To save her kids. So, because moms are like that. I from that point on, though, was always quite interested in sort of demystifying, to some extent, the crystal healing community. At least through my perspective, not trying to like change the community as a whole, but like find my relationship to this thing that, by virtue of some deeper phenomena or simply the placebo effect, basically I identify with saving my life.
The placebo effect's really interesting, right? Because it actually, doesn't exactly matter what it is, but as long as it works, it doesn't matter what the object or process necessarily is. But I think it could be utilized a lot more if doctors were also psychologists, you know?
Sure.
And you could get a patient to, or find out what they believe in naturally and just prescribe it as if it were going to work. But then I'm sure there's a lot of like
ethics dilemmas that come up with that. And malpractice insurance is
yes,
expensive
exactly.
already.
Lawsuits.
Yeah. But you're not wrong in that. There's a lot more potential there still. That being said, though, I also found this deeply satisfying ASMR quality to looking at crystals, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, especially those in more of a altered state type culture, background, perspective, momentary, glimpse of something you think is somehow revealing itself to you.
Yeah.
I remember after that always being enthralled by like the mineral collections at museums. So there's in the Denver Natural History Museum. I'm not sure if it's still there, but when I was a kid, there was this exhibit of like a crystal cave that you could walk up and like look into, and you could press buttons that would illuminate parts of the cave like way back. And like, if it does still exist as an adult, it's definitely a diorama, right? And it's not like you're deep in the center of the earth or something. But as a kid, this thing only needed to go back 5 or 6 feet to create this like deep sense of immersion. And I would just, spend probably a lot more time than my parents expected me to looking at that little cave diorama and walking around and, learning as much as I could from even a geological standpoint, mineralogical standpoint. Just really felt deeply curious about crystallography and related subjects, which, while I didn't pursue professionally, definitely influenced my interest in material science and my current work in engineering.
Yeah.
I almost, though, kept them at too high regard to become a gemologist myself or a geologist. I really respect people who do that work.
So yeah, we should talk about maybe just briefly. We don't have to go into super detail, but about your job that you have, and then maybe we can come back to where music entered your life as like something that captivated you.
Yeah.
You just brought up engineering, so I thought we might touch on that for a second.
Sure. I mean, for a good 10 years or so, and actually when we met back in 2012,
yeah.
I was subsisting solely off of being a musician.
Right.
Art was my sole path at that time. And it's not an easy path.
Right. That's what I keep telling people.
Yeah, and I don't think the old heads do it because it's easy.
Right. Yeah.
It's magic in its own sense. But I wanted to allow my music to exist in its own right without sort of this need to produce it at a certain rate or share on social media so often, or rely on my art to pay for my sandwich for lunch. Which when you can do that, it feels pretty powerful and exciting. But in order to preserve my art, because I went through a pretty hard time, 2014, 2015, living in New York, which is quite expensive, to put it mildly, realizing that I could subsist off of music if I toured constantly, but then paying for rent in New York didn't really make sense.
Because you're not ever there.
Right. And I'm definitely more of a periodic, if not like fairly frequent homebody. Like I like to get out and adventure, love going on memorable trips with people, still love going to music events, but like doing it all the time didn't really just fit with me personally.
That's a lot of self-awareness, I would say, to realize that at a point where you saw the path opening up in front of you of like, oh, I could just tour all the time, have this apartment in New York City, and like
it seems cool.
Yeah, it seems cool, but
it can be.
But you realize that it wasn't for you. And was that a hard decision, or was it just like, duh, I can't do that?
Man, in retrospect, it was a duh, I can't do that.
Yeah.
But in the moment, it was a really hard decision.
Uh-huh.
Because I felt like if I stopped then, I would be giving up the opportunity to continue to pursue it and to continue to grow into it, continue to meet people through music that I can collaborate with and like develop long and fruitful bonds with over time. It felt like I might lose that community as well by like taking that step back. So at the time, I was looking at it in a very binary fashion. You know, it was very like black and white. Like either I keep doing this or I don't.
Yeah.
And now, and I'll get to sort of like the current point here in a minute, but like obviously now it's like there's a much more nuanced perspective and nuanced take that life will provide you with, you know?
Yeah.
So I decided in that moment back in like 2014 to go back to school, and thought about what I could do to sustain not just myself, but my art and my relationship to my friends and my family, be able to show up and be the best, you know, community member that I can be, for example, as, you know, quite possibly being employed in the field of engineering. I knew the money would be fairly good.
Yeah.
You know, it's not necessarily like surgeon money or financer on Wall Street
you're
money.
well off. You're like way better than someone who's scraping by, or like, to use the visual artist metaphor, like just paying their way through paintings, living painting to painting, or paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, however you want to say it. And would you say that like having that bit of cushion, like, does that put you at ease to make the type of music that you would really want to make?
Yeah, that's actually been the I think most substantial creative element to come out of it is I do feel like I'm now essentially free to pursue my art in my own way. And it hasn't cut off the ties with the community. You know, there's not like a sense of loss of contact with all my friends who are artists still and still going that route, and working really hard at it, and many of them succeeding against, you know, the odds, or you know, because they're incredibly adept.
Yeah.
So I find myself in a position now where, yeah, I do have to spend a good amount of my daytime hours at a lab, pretty close to your spot here in Colorado. And, you know, time management is becoming the more important thing to still explore music, but it's completely possible, and I found myself able to actually give myself time and permission to explore things that may not hit a dance floor in the same way, for example. That's not necessarily the priority. Or to, you know, try to get out something pretty soon just to stay relevant, so to speak. So that need to stay relevant is sort of like, you know, left my general like creative lexicon. And I do want to again just like restate that I deeply respect people who are able to do that.
Sure. Yeah.
If you can follow your bliss to the ends of the earth, and if it takes you there, and if you can come back home and you really enjoy your life, like, that's phenomenal. I deeply applaud that. I think that's one of the more commendable lifestyles that a human being can experience and
definitely
to continue.
But just to bring it back, it's all about how well you know yourself and how well you're going to interface with your art. And you knew that if I go this route, I probably will either get burnt out or just won't have a good time.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, everybody's different, right? So it's not just like my psychological take of it, my like financial take on this. It was also like physiological. Like I need a good amount of sleep every night.
Yeah.
I can't just like get 6 hours and feel, you know, fairly okay. I'll just feel like garbage and won't really have my day to its fullest, basically. So
yeah, that started happening. I guess either happening to me, or I started really noticing it about 3 or 4 years ago. The whole sleep thing.
It's also getting older.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like it could be getting older. It could just be that like I was just ripping and running and just having a good time, and then it caught up with me.
That's kind of how I felt too. Because it's a very tempting lifestyle to just continue to fire all cylinders on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's so invigorating and exciting in many ways.
Totally.
There's moments of disappointment and frustration, like sound issues on stage, that kind of stuff, or other things that can go awry. But overall, it can be pretty enticing and energizing.
Yeah.
Because in a way, like you feel deleveraged from the bullshit of our society.
Yeah.
And that's a very freeing thing. I think that almost is like as much a definition of the American dream as the traditional take on it, right? Like just genuinely pursuing your freedom and your bliss and making good on it. But I was like, okay, maybe I don't have to sell my soul to be an engineer,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to work on projects that I don't think are ethical. I don't necessarily have to grind out 60 plus hours a week and just not have any time to do creative things. Like there could be a path here. And I was really fortunate to have that door opened, and part of it was hard work, also part of it was just opportunity and dumb luck.
Did you get an engineering degree?
So I just have an associate's in industrial design.
Oh, okay.
So I was like, okay, I want to finish school, but I want to get it done quick.
Yeah.
And then see where that takes me, and if I need to go back to school
hopefully
later,
your employer will pay for it.
Right. So I found myself in a position now where I'm a hardware engineer for Amazon Robotics and Artificial Intelligence, and I did it on a 2-year degree.
Nice.
So I have minimal student loans, which is a nice thing for
Very
sure.
Nice.
But I mean, I might still have to go back to school in the future. If I do, maybe my employer will pay for it. But I have enough time and bandwidth right now to focus on my creative endeavors in a way that, like, before I couldn't, because like I would be really reluctant to spend the money required for a Euro rack modular setup.
Yeah.
Back in 2014,
when all you had were gig to gig kind of paychecks, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I would feel like I would have to really have a really known set of creative values and production value around this thing in order to invest in it.
Well, also, just for practical reasons, I mean, you can take a modular synth on the road, but sometimes they get a little out of hand and you need a place for them. You need like a studio for them, basically.
Yeah, totally. Dialing in a modular rack in a live setting is a mastery that I do not yet have, basically. Definitely some people out there like Anthony from Papadosio that are adept at that. Totally.
Congrats to being a dad too, Anthony, if you're listening to this.
Hope family is happy and healthy and all is going great.
Yeah.
I'm not there yet with modular, but I'm finding my way in the studio so far, and it's been a really magical experience. But I before wouldn't be able to explore these things. I rebuilt out, especially during COVID, a lot of my creative flow in hardware to sort of get outside the box of Ableton.
Yeah.
Which I've been in for a long time. I've been using Ableton since Ableton 4 way back in the day.
What are they at now? 9?
11.
10? 11.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes. So now Ableton is my final composition step. So I'll sketch out everything in hardware. I'll like lay out projects in my MPC by Akai and build out as much as I can with my hands. And then final assembly is in Ableton.
Interesting.
And it's still one of the most fun parts, like, to be fair, but I don't do it all there.
That's so interesting because it's literally the exact opposite for a lot of painters, a lot of artists. Like, I just got an iPad the other day, and, hallelujah to that. But it's a great tool, especially for making sketches or mural mock-ups, right? Mm-hmm. So you're talking about using Ableton, which is just completely digital audio workspace, right? And going from the analog, using your hands, plugging things in, hitting the beat sequencer, whatever it is, then you put it in this middle zone onto your Akai MPC, and then I'm assuming you sort of play it.
Yeah, I've been
make the composition.
Getting a little better at finger drumming.
Yeah,
I used to drum quite a bit on, actual kits, but I don't have room or the sound space to do that right now. So that was kind of a way of getting back into laying out grooves more physically. Just using my brainstem, just kind of knocking things out without needing to bother my neighbors or, carve out a whole space in my apartment for a drum kit. I'd still love that in the future, but the MPC has been super fun. I'm really glad to start projects that way when it comes to beats. And that's been an awesome investment. I don't regret a single dollar of that, that cost. It was a really good route to go, and especially because it has a bunch of like CVs or control voltage outs on it that I can use to control the modular as well.
Oh wow, nice.
When I got the MPC, I wasn't necessarily planning on a modular in the near future, but it already had the functionality and the ports I needed basically to rope everything together.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting because that it literally goes the opposite way for a lot of painters, where it's like we start in a digital. I mean, nowadays typically. And then you take it to the, like, especially on murals where you're using like your whole body, you take it into that kinesthetic realm, I guess. And you're starting kinesthetic and then polishing it up and making it real nice in Ableton. Is that where you do your mixing too?
Yeah, for the most part. I got a new audio interface too, which I really like. It's a Behringer. Sorry to folks out there who are not huge fans, but they have stepped up their game recently. So I have the Flow 8, which is like a rare combination of audio interface and mixer. And it has an app as well for app control, so I can walk around the room and dial stuff in if I want to.
Nice.
I have physical faders to control my channels with, and it has enough inputs and outputs to do everything I need right now, but I can't really go beyond that. So I have like 8 inputs, I have like a couple sends, and it means I have to stay pretty tidy with my hardware setup. So I've pegged it where it is right now. I need to like get some new music out before I can excuse myself on any further purchases on hardware.
Sweet.
Because it's a rabbit hole for sure.
Yeah.
Especially when you feel like you can afford it, because when you think you do,
I got a job.
the life isn't always super static like that. So I don't want to take that for granted and still be reasonable.
Totally.
It's hard though.
Totally. Well, that actually comes to another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is where are you at now in your music? Are you using the Geosonification to make tracks now? So is that like your basis, or how's your process going right now?
It's like at sort of a kind of split in the road, where I feel like pursuing this more, to be honest, like academic and engineering oriented side of music through Geosonification is kind of its own path now. I think I'll still use my moniker of SkyTree for that creative output. But I still definitely want to make beat and bass oriented music and really melodic and textural and like granular IDM, electro, EDM stuff. Man, I hate using genres for describing what I'm trying to do sometimes because I don't know if that works at all.
It's so funny. Everybody's doing the Spotify rap thing, and Sarah, my girlfriend, said that Spotify told her that her favorite genre was vapor glitch. Fuck is that, man?
It definitely sounds vapor-esque. Maybe vaporware.
Not even vaporwave or vaporware. Like, no, just vapor glitch. It's like,
I mean, the term is not something I have immediate issue with. If somebody described my music with a genre I wouldn't have otherwise thought of, I'm not going to take offense to it. But like, I feel like it's too much onus on me to describe it.
Well, totally. Yeah, I guess it is the perceiver's job to sort of categorize it as they will.
Yeah.
But it just seems a little like ridiculous.
Yeah. Well,
I guess the more specific you can get, better. But I don't know.
Well, so I did put out a record at the end of last year that I actually started most of the tracks on in New York when I was living in Brooklyn. And when I moved to Colorado, I had all of these memories that I needed to sift through, and I kind of wanted to like end that chapter and like start fresh. So I spent a good chunk of COVID as well going through like all of those tracks, polishing them up, mastering them. It was my first time mastering a release on my own. I can't say I did a great job. I think I did a pretty okay job. I was
Uh-huh.
satisfied with it enough to keep potentially taking a stab at mastering music.
Nice. What's so for people? I guess for me too. Like, what is the actual difference between just mixing and then mastering?
Oh man, some
Is
people will
super
describe it
technical or
a combination between super technical and alchemy, depending on who you ask.
okay?
Everybody's got their own process. There's no like one rote way to master
Sure.
music, right? It really is a matter of uh, both technical expertise and sheer um, listening, the
Yeah,
ability to like
intuitive
really
listening or something. Yeah.
carefully analyze and just experience, just mountains of experience with the best mastering engineers.
Yeah.
They're that good because they've worked in mastering for 20 years and just have an innate understanding of their hardware and of what to listen to, and also how to work with the artist, or artists in the case of a band or a larger group. But to answer it as best as I can, so when I'm in the mixing phase, I just want to make sure everything has its place. I'm heavily gain staging everything by keeping everything fairly quiet, so I'm not like introducing any accidental compression or artifacts around distortion that I don't want. I'm just sort of setting up the sound stage, and in mastering, it's more introducing compression on purpose in some specific areas, bringing things up to more of like a full-bodied expression of this gain stage, sort of like pre-master mixing stage. This might not make any sense to anybody listening that
I'm
doesn't have
visualizing
experience
it. I'll try
in
and
it.
use words to visualize it for people.
Yeah.
But it's like taking maybe taking the mixing part is taking values of a painting, right? And you're placing them in spots that give sort of a three-dimensional shape to your objects in your painting. And I imagine that's sort of what you're doing, if that visual metaphor makes any sense, in mixing. And then mastering is more of the fine-tuning and bringing things to a fuller color maybe, and a fuller like richness that you wouldn't hear in just sort of the mixing stage, where sure everything's organized and arranged and like no frequencies are chopping into each other in weird ways, but then at the end it's all about like popping that highlight and deepening that shadow, or popping the high frequency maybe and like rounding out the bass. Or
Exactly.
is
Is
that pretty good?
Yeah, that makes sense, because like in the mixing stage, like at the end of that, if you're satisfied with the stage that you're at, ideally like basically all your information is there. It's in the waveform. It might be more subtle than the final result after mastering, but all of your information, both composition, EQing, even to a significant extent like panning or working with phase, is there after you're done mixing. And then you basically take this essentially finished product, in a way, creatively finished, and add additional. Well, no. I'm going to walk that back. You don't really
away, right?
To some extent. So it's not really additive or subtractive. It's more polishing. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So like, finishing a sculpture, maybe I haven't like sculpted anything with marble, but I can imagine like once you get the final sculpture, quote unquote final, there's still like polishing and like finish work to do, and maybe staging it in the right lighting, having it go to the right place. All that stuff is more what I describe to the mastering equivalent.
It's like contextual
sculpture.
a little bit as well.
Totally.
That's cool.
So the textures might already exist there, but it's like, how do you make them pop in the way that you want in the lighting and in the environment, in like the culture in which it will be experienced.
Oh yeah, nice.
And in the case of like audio, somebody might be listening to it on their phone, so I'll definitely go and like listen to tracks on my phone to make sure that they don't sound completely washed out and impenetrable and confusing.
Right.
But also like in a really nice set of headphones, a really nice set of monitors in a car. Car test is essential.
And then if you have the ability, like, the functions or the or the Hennessy's or whatever, right?
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
get them out on the large speakers.
Yes. Yeah, which is a fun stage that isn't, I don't think it's essential, but it can be really informative and also pretty fun.
Yeah.
Um, so having worked on that release and mastering it as best as I could anyway, I feel really satisfied with the result, and I think it actually provides a good stage from which I'll continue to develop that side of my music. I don't think it will really throw anybody off who otherwise has been listening for a little while when I start diving more into the geosonification side of things, because I've already been working in ambient music and sound design, sort of more textural expression for quite a while as well, and it will definitely still fit within that ecosystem, essentially. So that's why I don't feel
you
like
don't
we
have
need
to completely rebrand or
no new pseudonym. I don't necessarily need anything else than maybe a new logo at this point, because it's been a while.
What's up? I got you.
All right, awesome. Know a guy?
Yeah. So I do want to talk about more like specifically process stuff. My question always about process, I'm always curious, where on the spectrum do you fall between imposing like something that you either hear or an idea you have onto the, quiescent cloud of the moment, or do you just work with the moment and kind of navigate your way through to the end result? So are you more intentional, or are you more flow based?
I think it's a order of operations in a way. So like initially very flow based.
Yeah.
For the most part. Again, like I really want to minimize that barrier for entry, not just for myself, but when discussing creative outlets with friends and colleagues, kids. It's just really, I think, my best place to advocate for the ease of entry to what people might really care about doing. If they want to be pursuing the specific angle of creativity, especially for kids, reminding them that they can find, this element of creative expression and satisfaction without needing to have things like drilled into them, like going to piano lessons for 2 years or whatever it might take. Of course, that can be super helpful.
Right.
But it can be daunting for kids that maybe just don't feel like that's the path for them. So I kind of try to treat my inner child, so to speak, like with kid gloves appropriately, and just remind myself that, especially given limited time after work, for example, that it's perfectly fine to just sit down on the MPC and like sketch out a new beat, even if I have like 50 already that I'm not using.
Yeah.
Like I definitely make a lot of sketches before I sit down and get into more of the intentional space. Because the happy accidents will pile up to the point where they'll sort of point the way.
Yeah.
And then I start to build the scaffolding around what it needs to, like, as a trellis, like, grow towards this teleological attractor in which it will eventually exist and cohabitate. Like,
we should get some context too when you're talking about kids. You were teaching an Ableton course, right? For a while.
Yeah, I taught Ableton and field recording and sound design at the Brooklyn Home of Music.
Okay.
For a couple of years.
What did teaching teach you?
Well, that's a good question, man. Yeah. It taught me that I didn't understand everything under the hood in Ableton.
Sure,
like you think you know all the functions on something until you don't, because you're confronted with the hard reality of a question you can't answer. So it's kind of Dunning-Kruger-esque.
Yeah.
But I did find that approach to like lowering the barrier for entry and making things fun, especially in field recording classes where, we get like 10 kids, usually from art colleges around Brooklyn, to just walk around the neighborhood where we had our music school set up with their phones or field recorders, whatever they had, and just like recording random sounds and then coming back and throwing them into Ableton and just making a quick sketch or a beat out of them. It definitely reinforced that sense of fun, but also like the ability to genuinely express and produce something out of that fun jumping off point. So for the most part, students would have a really fun time, like field recording for the first time, because you start like interacting with the world a little differently, which also connects back to the geosonification. It's like this is part of the narrative of like talking with the world in a way that feels really satisfying and existentially rich.
Yeah.
So I think if I were to ever be in that position again, I would probably continue to start with a really playful point and kind of like in my own production process, you know, happy accidents leading into intention, kind of impart that where appropriate to people that might be interested in doing something similar.
Nice. Did you have any mentors yourself?
Yeah, no. You know, people come and go. Some people stick around. I try not to expect too much out of mentors that might only step into my life for 6 months, that kind of thing. There was one guy back in the hometown where my dad lives, and I went to high school and, you know, had a lot of my formative years, even though I'm from Colorado. I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. There was a guy in the city council at the time. His name was Woody McBride. And he was always kind of a presence in the town. Like he put on the music events. He still does, like the small town, like
Shouts Woody.
Shouts to Woody. Yeah, exactly. Woody is in his own right, and I didn't know this when I first met him, but later on it became quite evident. Like he is a legend in the techno community. He goes by DJ ESP.
Oh wow.
And he was really part of like the early like roots of rave culture. And you know, once I became more privy to that, and he knew that I was working on electronic music as well, we started to spend more time together. And he helped me get my first shows, including at like First Avenue in Minneapolis, which is, you know, pretty surreal because I love Prince, and that's where Prince used to play a lot, and really made First Avenue what it is. It was a really informal mentorship with somebody who initially was just, you know, a friend, but as I got to know him and understand that like a good chunk of the year he'd be touring Europe and coming back from like these mega festivals and things like that,
and then being on the city council,
hanging
crazy.
out with my dad and putting together like talent shows at the county fair and that kind of thing. He's very, very unassuming in his personal life, which I haven't talked with him for a little while, but still is very much imparted on my relationship with music and connecting with larger audiences out there. It's not something that necessarily means you can't just step into a normal life at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because we all kind of
you can
live
take
it
off
anyway.
your superhero clothes or whatever.
Or not even really kind of wear them playfully or sarcastically to some extent.
Right.
So that's something I definitely found myself doing as I was getting kind of sucked into this like identity as SkyTree. That's an alias. In the past, I would take it as a name.
So nonchalant about it.
Yeah. So I've definitely kind of gotten more playful with my relationship. Again, kind of like more full circle going back to my initial years of making music. It's an alias, it's an expression, it's a thing I have to do. It's like a compulsion.
Yeah.
But I'm just me at the end of the day. So
yeah.
It takes the pressure off also.
Oh yeah, totally. Did you find that, so would you call this slowing down period, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, would you call that a hiatus necessarily? Or was it just a reconfiguration? Or somewhere in between?
This might be like too bombastic a term, but like I would more relate to it as like a renaissance personally of like my internal relationship with creativity and my understanding of what long-term creative work looks like for me.
Nice.
It's completely reconfigured everything. So the hardware and like the studio setup is like a metaphor for the internal process and everything that kind of led to that point.
Sure.
I feel not like a different person, but definitely more grown into my my footprint is, you know, Evan on Earth, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So in that sense, I feel like I can approach it more realistically. It's a really paradoxical combination between years of playing music live and connecting to a live audience and going to festivals and hanging out with people, you know, in their, camp area after a set and just like talking casually when everybody's a little spun and having a really good time, just, riffing off of whatever, to, going back to my roots as, exploring electronic music in my basement with a tape deck with nobody around that I knew that appreciated or would listen to any electronic music that was, already in existence, say on Warp Records with Aphex Twin and Autechre and Boards of Canada, let alone my stuff.
How did you get introduced to those artists? Do you remember?
I remember being introduced to Aphex for sure. So we had like a giant satellite dish in the backyard of my house growing up, and we could get like basically pirate satellite, if you dialed it to the right point in the sky. So we got MTV2 back when it was still
really MTV2
actually music videos. Yeah. And of course, like the later you would stay up, the weirder it would get. Basically, it was kind of like the Adult Swim of its time in that sense, but all music videos just, on a constant progression towards the stranger and stranger realms of expression. So I stayed up until 2 a.m. once with all my friends. We were just hanging out, I think, painting Warhammer figures. Nice. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but like desktop or tabletop gaming.
I've heard of Warhammer.
Yeah,
I actually watched back in the day when I was learning Photoshop, I watched a tutorial of a guy who was drawing a Warhammer character.
Yeah.
And he was drawing like the book. I can't remember what it was called, but anyway, sorry.
No worries. Like I didn't really play what my friends did.
Yeah.
But they would just give me their armies to paint because I would just sit there and paint. I loved painting figurines. I still like paint models and stuff like that.
Oh, nice.
So we definitely got, love of paint in common. Yours is more prolific and specific to your creativity, but I love like sitting down and doing really fine detailed work on sculptures or little 3D pieces, basically. So I was just like painting Warhammer figures, getting really in the zone. My friends were tabletop gaming next to the TV with like the grainy,
MTV2,
pirate satellite signal coming in.
Like, and back in the day, that had to be curated by a human.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And an interesting one at that, I would reckon, because like at 2 a.m. The "Come to Daddy" video by Aphex Twin came on, and like everybody in the room just stopped what they were doing. Like all my friends just like, I think they were probably even like, they had rolled some dice and didn't even check, and they rolled off the table because they were just like sitting there staring at this like crazy, cinematically bizarre and like dreamlike music video with music quite parallel to the bizarre dreamlike nature of the visuals. So that was really striking. And then from there on, I just got everything I could by Warp, because back in the late 90s, that was like really all you had. There weren't all these indie labels. There wasn't Bandcamp. There wasn't Spotify. Like you were pretty much set with the labels that were doing the kind of thing that were interesting to you, was interesting to you. So Warp was my like initial like deep dive into electronic music and the esoteric, bizarre, like highly creative and like at times almost indecipherably creative potential for electronic music.
Sure.
But I was still like the only one out of my friend group that really listened to that stuff a lot.
Is that what you're aiming for in your music? Like the maybe another way to say this is, do you have a purpose? And yeah, what are you aiming for aesthetically and even spiritually or mentally?
Yeah, most definitely. So there aren't like specific bullet points or like criteria that need to meet for a track to be finished and to sort of for it to fit into the discography of what I've done up until this point or up until that point. But for me, I feel enveloped by a finished track. It becomes an environment. It becomes a place where I can hang out and explore things. And that's part of my love of especially early Warp work, in particular Boards of Canada, is the ability to like still rediscover or even find new things in music that's been out since 1997. So I love having music that has replay value, both in my personal collection and my aspirations for my own music. For there to be a sense of exploratory fringe, more in the IDM type sense, while still being fairly, hopefully, listenable and relatable, and also fairly organic too. So I love finding like another dumb term that I would be hesitant to use, but we have to
Come
use
on,
the words.
Let's go.
Like,
hear it.
let's see, like technobiological,
Okay. Yeah.
semi-cybernetic, but more in the context of like machines don't have to be just sitting in a warehouse in Brooklyn or in a skyscraper somewhere. They can be out in the hillside all by themselves, kind of just being part of the environment.
Yeah.
It's an interesting juxtaposition that really fascinates me. So that's part of where I'm going with the modular, as well as like as soon as we hit spring, or I guess if we keep getting this like fall for winter in Colorado, I might just do this soon, which is to take my modular out to Rocky Flats outside of Boulder,
Yeah.
which is a former nuclear catastrophe site, and using the radioactivity in the background to trigger generative music on the synth, and just set up a video of the environment playing music with the synth just sitting there on the hillside with the mountains behind it, and it's also kind of like this reach to remind myself that humans are bizarre and we are definite outliers with respect to our biome, but we're still part of it, essentially. So that's my relationship to technology as well, is that it can be planted firmly in the right context in the middle of nowhere and still be part of nature in a way.
Yeah.
So if my music evokes that sense in me, then I feel like it's approaching the sensibility that I really enjoy.
It's almost like passing the Turing test, but within your own framework.
Yeah.
In a way, like you're like, okay, I can't tell that, or I don't know what the criteria would be, but it's, I think every person, every artist does that, right?
There's got to be some threshold.
You just know.
Exactly. So when I feel like I know, then there's obviously a sense of relief or sometimes elation that comes with that, or excitement or impatience if like you can't get to the project right away and you have to go grocery shopping instead. But yeah, it's also because like the kind of music that I want to hear in this context doesn't readily exist, and I am constantly thankfully continuing to explore new music. I was a little fearful for a while as I got older that I would just like stick with the old, traditional electronica and IDM of the 90s and stuff like that. But I keep finding all this new amazing music, and there's so many different expressions of it, but there's still this one particular nexus point that I don't hear, and the only way to hear it is to make it.
Nice.
And when I do that, it's sort of selfish. It's like, so I have this thing I can listen to that takes me to the place I wanted to go. I don't often go back and re-listen to a lot of my music, but once I get there, I'm like, okay, this exists now, thank goodness, and I can step back and move on to the next thing.
So you just released an album, like during the quarantine or pandemic?
Yeah, so it was like over a year ago, September of last year.
Okay.
My newest album is one I'm really happy with. I think out of all my works so far, I feel like it holds its ground the best, but it's also had the least time to prove it. So, like any creative outlet, you just tend to love your newest thing.
Yeah.
But the newest album is called Infraplanetary. It's a sort of a concept album, infra being within and in between, and also somewhat SEO compliant, because infraplanetary is not an actual term that exists out there. Nice. So if you just search for that, it's the only thing that comes up.
There you go.
But it's sort of like the spaces in between our world, other worlds, imaginary or real.
Yeah.
And the intersection again between creativity and science.
Nice.
The hard kind of like fast hitting the ground of the actual planet while being a human with an imagination and a compulsive need for creativity, and a relationship spiritually to that hard reality around you.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like these terms that you're sort of concocting, like geosonification and infraplanetary.
Yeah.
Okay. Infraplanetary. Go find it on Bandcamp.
It's there.
Or even Spotify if you don't want to pay for it.
Also on Spotify. Fine with
mostly me. Bandcamp.
Yeah, why not?
So, okay, we're kind of caught up to the present now, in this, what we're trying to have be like a linear conversation. Mm-hmm. What's on the horizon for you? You have any shows coming up?
So I'm working right now with Evan Bluetech on a label showcase for his label Behind the Sky Music coming up in February, I think February 3rd at the Cervantes Masterpiece Ballroom in Denver. Sent over the contract for that and the final deets, so contract needs to be signed. And I'm not going to officially announce the gig until he does, but that's the next thing on the horizon, which I'm really excited about. So we're going to
have to wait to air this episode for
a little bit? No, I think it'll be fine.
Okay, cool.
I'm just going to still put a tentative peg in that until I see the final thing signed.
It's like selling a painting.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to jinx
it. I want that painting. You're like, yeah, sure you do.
I'm really excited for it, though. It will be the first live show I've had in a few years, actually.
Nice.
And like with everything else, it's an opportunity to sort of reset that and build out my live set a little differently than I, would have before. Especially because, like, when you're playing show after show, you don't really sit down and think, okay, like, how do I rebuild this entirely? Like, what new goals do I have? You get into a flow, you learn your gear, you build a relationship with it, and you keep using it.
Do you practice or rehearse that aspect, like the live aspect?
I should. I got 2 months, so I have some practice to do for sure.
Nice.
When I was touring all the time, you get really used to your set, and there would definitely be weeks where I would go without practicing for a set, and I'd play every night or something like that. You just kind of get into a groove. So at that point, It's not as essential, but given this is like a fresh start, given the profile of the gig and the opportunity to work with Blue Tech, I'm definitely going to rehearse.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And you're also now, I'm assuming you're incorporating the modular in there too, in some capacity, or
dabbling with it. So as part of the exploration phase too, is like, well, how do I set this up, especially in the context of Behind the Sky, which is like really focused on analog synthesis, modular synthesis, but really predominantly analog. Being able to bring my modular to the show is probably going to be a plus in that regard, but I have to use it responsibly. And like I was saying earlier, I'm not like super comfortable with having everything dialed in advance, or the high probability for something to go slightly amiss during a set, which if you're doing a pre-recorded thing and just adding effects, it's a different ballgame.
Yeah.
So I think I might just use it as an outboard effects processor of sorts.
Okay.
And use sends to
play it safe at first, and then once you have your sea legs about you, you can get out there on the water a little bit.
Totally. Or do some analog noodlings for ambient interludes here and there, and then get back to the tracked stuff, basically.
Mm-hmm. That's actually what I really like about the more recent times I've seen Blue Tech. It seems like he's just kind of jamming on the modular, but you hear parts of tracks, but it's like, I don't know, it's really, really cool. You can tell he's put in work on that.
Yeah, no, he plays his arp like Hendrix played the guitar in many ways, and then one of the other artists on that lineup is Lisa Belladonna, who's one of the premier artists on the label, and she does a lot of the patch programming for Moog synthesizers.
Nice.
And the Bob Moog Foundation, so there's a lot of interchange there. Basically, I'll be in the midst of some masters of synthesis, and I'm going to make sure to respect that, but not overstep my bounds, basically. I'm just there to open the show. I'm happy to do that, but it has made me wonder, do I want to do more live music in the future? Because I'm definitely more personally oriented towards like headphone experience. Like I love like the very specific experiences going back to like formative albums like The Orbs Adventures Beyond the Ultra World. Or
Puffy White Clouds.
Yeah, totally. Or Future Sound of London, going back to like early 90s stuff even. Like all those early formative experiences for me were in headphones. I didn't have like a big stereo system when I was like a kid. I didn't have like a boombox when I was a teenager. I just had, mediocre headphones and a tape deck. And that's how I experienced a lot of the more formative aha moments in my sort of like musical progression, both as a listener and as a maker. So that's kind of the more ideal outlet, I think, still for listening to the music I love now, as well as the ideal environment to share my music with others. Knowing that somebody is having a personal experience, maybe just by themselves, listening to something that I made a while ago, feels more relatable and more like authentic to how I've experienced a lot of my favorite music. But there's still something really magical in the live performance
Sure, yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah. I think a lot of people experience music very somatically or kinesthetically, you know.
Yeah.
And that's why everybody dances. So I think that, you know, from what I've heard, I actually honestly haven't heard the new album. Sorry about that.
No worries. I didn't bring it for you, so I'm sorry about that. Next time I come by, I'll bring a copy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But your music is both those things for me. It's like you can wiggle to it. You can also just like nod your head with headphones on and get introspective and create, you know, luckily for visual artists, we get to listen to whatever we want while we paint. So yeah, it's both those things, I think, at least from what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like get into head bob moments and get into more of like a flow state while I'm sketching out beats on the MPC, for example. And that's when the cats will like stop chasing each other and running around the house and having the zoomies, and they'll just like sit down on the studio chairs while I'm jamming out and like bobbing my head. And I definitely like having a steady sense of groove in music. I love like really broken beat approaches. Like Flying Lotus is beyond any sort of like swing or shuffle, but yeah, I like plotting sort of like really rhythmic progressions in music, sort of like more laid back in the production aesthetic. And that's something that I've seen a lot now in the music community as it stands within our scene, so to speak, is like there's a lot of like hyper complex programming, and that like the engineering of these sounds is at peak quality in many ways. You know, the tipper aesthetic is all encompassing, and like the gold standard for a lot of producers out there, both aspiring and established. To name one artist, you know, I think that's not going to really hit anybody as like a blindside point to make,
right?
Listening to the podcast right now, but like I really love the ability to be messy. Again, like reducing the barrier for entry, making things as like creatively accessible. I still find myself listening to shitty old tapes of, you know, what's a good example? Like 80s electro. Or beaten up vinyl that, you know, hasn't been cleaned in a really long time. And even when you clean it, we all know it's not going to be what it was. But even when it was produced at that time, it wasn't up to the par of the sound design and aesthetic that we have now as an expectation. So I still find myself listening to what might seem from an audio engineering standpoint more shitty. But it just feels more human to me. As things get more and more polished and perfect, I find myself, you know, sinking back to like more of a nostalgic take on what makes me feel comfortable with the sound. Because if it's so upfront and like all encompassing, it's fascinating, and like Tipper's a master of the game, hands down. Mad respect.
But that's not the only flavor that's out there,
right? And there's a push and a pull. There's like a, you know, as soon as something exists, there's like the counter to that thing existing, which is in this case stuff that's existed before.
Well, one thing that just occurred to me is that I think the reason that I like electronic music so much is that those sounds, like, okay, so every sound is separate, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's part of it.
That's kind of it, right? But in reality, you never hear a sound separate from other sounds. It's like everything is in context, and everything is like, it is like in a 3D space. So if you were, even I guess when you hear the separated electronic music sound come back into a full composition, it is in another context again. And then if you hear it in headphones, different context, through large speakers, another different context. But it is like this kind of like unreality thing about it that makes it both so appealing, and then maybe for some people so like turns them off.
Too artificial or whatever. So like I really love whether by intention or just by accident or lack of attention, music that electronic music that sort of muddies those waters a little bit.
Yeah.
So like going back to My Bloody Valentine and like Slow Dive and like the shoegaze era, and now of course like new gaze, where there's this wash of sounds, and it's almost like you're in a sea of ghosts, and like reaching out and touching one is impossible, but you know it's there.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I love Boards of Canada so much, because it's electronic music, quote unquote, but like I'm still finding new things in tracks that I've listened to hundreds of times, because it's not always clear what's in there. Like the veils are definitely thick, and the transients you get out of mashing three sounds together is, for me personally, more interesting than a perfectly dialed in and designed snare and raw synthesis. That's important to know how to do, in my opinion. I think it's worth doing your homework, and you can get some really satisfying things out of that. But I still find that my favorite snare, for example, is like 5 different things mashed together. And transients popping up in different ways as you go through and compress and master it. And
explain what transients is for.
So looking at like a sine wave, basically, doesn't really have a transient, right? It's just this oscillating up and down sinusoidal waveform. A transient is sort of like where there's a sudden rising edge in the waveform. So if I rap on the desk, that knock creates a transient.
The attack is like sine waves like like that, like just kind of a steady, and then you dial up the frequency to make it higher or lower.
Totally. So a square wave has continuous transients in it, essentially. Especially because like a square wave isn't actually square when we listen to it, because you can't make a square wave go through the air. It's impossible. So you get these weird transients that pop up on the rising edge of the square. But when you throw multiple transients together, especially if you're doing it on tape where there's like a inherent compression involved, or you're downsampling it, or even just like working on the MPC with really high resolution samples and just like throwing them together and then trimming everything, you get these like hybrids and these like chimeras of sound where I love listening to a piece of sound design where I can't quite tell what it is. Like it could be a dog barking, a human, or like a pot falling on the ground. I'm not sure which one. That for me is like
ambiguity,
kind of the holy grail.
It's pretty cool.
Obviously your visual work is highly expressive and surrealist in ways. So
I love ambiguity.
Yeah,
it's not always the most popular thing,
right? Because it's not like a face or like a sexy thing that you can immediately relate to in a real world context.
You can't necessarily language it.
Yeah,
that's what I like about things. I think in general, you're like, I like this part.
Yeah. It's kind of
you
like,
can't say I like the woman in this painting, or the lion, or the star, or whatever. You
might not even be able to point to it. You just feel it. So like at that point, for example, with the previous illustration, like it might not even be a snare. You might not even know what to call it. So again, like this is
the thing that lands on the 2 and the 4.
Yeah. So if my music can be succinctly described in a particular genre, I don't feel like I would have hit the mark. And there are artists who do that with
that's
aplomb,
a cool paradox. Like, I wouldn't hit the mark if someone could actually
point to it and say, this is what it is.
This is the mark,
Let alone me, and I would be least I think qualified to label it myself. But like, I love finding the strange things in sound. There was definitely a formative moment when I was like 16 or so, and I had my first electric guitar, and this like Boss guitar multi-effects pedal, and I was just like looping that through a Tascam multi-track tape player, and really late at night by myself, started to hear these like voices come out of it, like these ghostly sounds, which I later actually discovered was very similar to what's in one of Aphéx's ambient tracks. It felt like I had stumbled upon again like the sea of ghosts that was untouchable and yet innately there. And it was kind of like the Ghost in the Machine idea. I had found something inside this set of otherwise known engineered pieces of hardware in my own hands that was greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah,
basically.
Exactly.
And I don't know how I got there. I don't know what the fuck caused that. I haven't been able to replicate that exact sound again.
And the thing about reality in general, I've found, is that if you have a great moment that can't be necessarily quantified, even if you recreate the steps that you think led you to that great moment, it doesn't necessarily happen.
Right.
Like you can have all your technical skills, tucked under your arm or at your waist, like ready to pull out.
Or some people with like massive backpacks, like Mr. Bill, for example,
yeah,
like
exactly,
piled with technical
Let me get
ability.
this thing out. But like it's not necessarily, you can't necessarily capture a vibe, quote unquote, because it's moment to moment and things tend to always change.
And I personally like that fact because
right.
I can't control it, Some people can fairly well like revisit specific things and are really diligent with their note taking and their memorization and their like brainstem data dumping.
But even
process.
then, yeah,
I'm not like that though.
But I feel like even then, unless I don't know, like you can't necessarily replicate things all the time, and this is getting more into the scientific realm, I guess, with replicating studies and things like this.
Sure.
But I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. I just had a real exciting moment and needed to talk.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, part of what that reminds me of, though, is like the things I've been diving into with the geosonification processes are inherently replicable.
Yeah.
So in terms of like the actual principles involved, I've been thinking
will
about...
you get the same exact result every time?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's the point I'm trying to make, is that like we can replicate the steps that got us there.
Yeah.
But I'll never paint it's hard for me to paint the same painting twice.
Yeah.
And I don't think you ever could. Even if you're like, this is the exact color mixture I made and I laid it on this way, even if you took notes that diligently, you would set them side by side, and an AI could be like, no, here are small differences here in the value and the way you place the thing.
So the process is like replicable, but is the outcome?
Right.
That's a much bigger question.
Yeah.
But I do want to be able to get to the point where, say, if at some point, I would really like to do like a children's museum exhibit or like sound sculpture where they can walk up and like with a mallet hit a big quartz crystal and put on headphones and hear it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's replicable.
Yeah, totally.
And would be, I think, super inspiring to me as a kid. If I were to have that opportunity, I would love to be able to share that with other people, whether it's a actual kid or a big kid like us.
Yeah.
It's still something that would basically be demonstrably repeatable to the point where I might be able to at some point make a synth module that incorporates some of these ideas. The same with like we haven't really gotten into the radioactivity stuff that much, but all these processes, if you have the specimens and you have the equipment, you can do the same kind of stuff.
Right,
it won't sound the same because that's where you get to have your own creative journey within those otherwise predefined terms. So again, like the intersection of creativity and science kind of being this interesting hybrid between replicability and chaos.
Yeah. 100%. I think that's what I was trying to get at, and I think we got there.
Awesome.
But I don't know if we can replicate it. We wouldn't be able to do it the same way next time.
We're recording, right?
Yeah. Oh, shit. So, yeah, I think we could wrap up here in a little bit. I wanted to ask you kind of a weird question that might throw you off. But I've asked, I think, every musician I've had on since this year, this question. And it is, what is a brutal fact about the music industry?
Oh, man. So Ben Jordan, who otherwise goes by the Flashbulb, put out a video, I think a couple days ago on this.
Oh, the guy, Ian something. Ian Hibbard or something like no. I don't want to get this guy's...
Ian O, we'll say.
Yeah.
Allegedly a journalist for the New York Times.
Well, he is a journalist. But
okay, all right.
He allegedly scammed a lot of musicians in this way. I'll include this video link in the show notes so that, and I don't usually go this detailed, but since we're getting into this territory, we might as well.
Yeah, and a big legal disclaimer too. Like we don't have any legal stakes in this, and I'm not a lawyer. Nor do I have one representing me right now, nor was I involved in this. But it's a really fascinating example of the sometimes like scammy underworld within the music industry and preying off of genuinely well-meaning, creative, and hardworking people.
Right.
So making money in music is very difficult, and it's not just like the hustle required. It's like that there are uh, people out there that will try to take advantage of it without having, necessarily a creative stake in the game themselves.
Right.
I personally haven't been taken advantage of, thank goodness, and knock on wood.
Yeah.
I am like a white boy, so it's easy for me to stay in my like privileged bubble in Colorado.
Sure.
But it does happen a lot, and I've definitely gotten a lot of offers for things that didn't pan out. So hence, like I don't like count my chickens before they hatch at this point, because
Right,
there's
yeah.
been so many experiences where I was like, this is my break, this is it,
Yeah.
and like when the break does come, you often don't know.
Yeah.
Not even like
You're
when it
not
happens,
totally aware of
you
it.
might not know until like later.
Yeah. You're like, I think it was around this time.
Yeah.
But I think to get back to this, I mean, by the way, Ben Jordan shout outs, because he's doing like pretty much investigative journalism on this topic.
Yeah.
And a lot of other ones too.
And also an amazing videographer and editor. He's gone all
Amazing
out.
musician too. Check out the Flashbulb if you don't know already.
I have a fun flashbulb story I can share after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Off mic.
On mic if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'll even be able to retell this story right now correctly. Basically, a journalist for the New York Times reached out to a bunch of musicians. He's like, hey, we want you to be involved in this project about cleaning up the ocean or something like this.
Mm-hmm. A noble goal. Like,
yeah, really
fantastic. Do this.
And then basically, they sent out the contract, and Ben, I think, was a little more seasoned than maybe the average person that this guy was reaching out to, in terms of like knowing his way around contracts and like looking into them deeply.
His bullshit filter was a little more refined at
Yeah,
that
there we
point
go.
than like a year one producer.
Yeah, sure. And what seemed like a great opportunity turned out to be like this guy was going to get 50% of the royalties, even though he didn't do anything creatively at all.
Mm-hmm. No music up front, or no money up front.
No cash
rather.
up front,
exactly.
yeah. Which, should be a red flag, I think, for if you're ever taking a commission or anything like that. This goes for visual artists, too. But anyway, it was a really great piece, and shouts to Ben for putting that out there.
Yeah, there were like 456 some artists that got conned into signing this contract, and a lot of them, like, I'm sure were excited to work with a reporter from the New York Times on like this very noble project, with the potential of, like, apparently he was saying that there would be the ability to work with Netflix and some other bigger names in entertainment out there.
There's basically what it comes down to is there's a lot of like abstract carrots being dangled in front of people's faces, i.e. artists, who are, I don't necessarily want to say desperate, but we're chomping at the bit for any good opportunity.
Yeah.
And if you throw around names like Netflix, New York Times journalist, all these things, right? And then basically the fine print is like, oh, we're going to pay you an exposure, and in return, this guy gets like songwriting credits on, however many songs each
There's
of these
thousands actually that ended up being part of this process.
So he's what looks like to be one of the most prolific creators on Spotify or something like this.
Yeah, but like to take
like crazy.
Take kind of a positive, or like a flipping this a little bit into a more personal note. Like for me, it's also a reminder that like as a creative person, anybody listening, we have an invaluable ember burning inside us at all times that cannot be extinguished, even if you try, or even if there's like times of darkness, it will just keep burning in there.
Right.
And it's ours, but it's also something to be shared, but not something that anybody else can ever truly claim to own. And unfortunately, sometimes that conflicts with the legalese out there. So like,
right.
I would just say, when in doubt, self-advocate, like have, if possible, a deeper sense of connection and like ownership and like, dare I say it, pride of your work.
Yeah.
That nobody has necessarily the final say on your creative ember, which is completely unique as far as I can tell to each one of us.
100%.
And when it is usurped, it's in paperwork only.
Yeah,
to
it's
some
only
extent.
a technicality.
Yeah,
right?
but we sometimes want that, like we want to give it away because we feel like it might have a better owner out there somewhere in the world. And like in my experience, and there might be some exceptions to this, but like there is no better owner than us,
Right.
as the individual with our creative spark.
Yeah.
So I've personally tried to retain the rights to all of my music and have thankfully succeeded in that. So it's all up on Bandcamp. If I don't like something anymore, sorry guys, I take it down. If somebody requests, hey, can you put this back up? I miss having this EP or whatever. I'll send it to them. But like I have, at this point, am really fortunate to have complete creative control over my output
That's
and
such
in my
a good
discography.
point. Yeah. Yeah. I think we'll end on that. If that's okay. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
I can give you the Ben Jordan story.
Oh, yeah.
quick.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me pause it real quick.
Sure.
All right, the Ben Jordan story. Let's hear it.
Sure. So thankfully through music, I've had the opportunity to spend some time with artists that I listened to for quite a while.
Michael, just a little bit more. That's good. That's good. You're good. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. So Ben Jordan story.
Yeah.
I feel really thankful to, in music, have spent some time with artists that I really looked up to for a long time, look up to this day, toured with some of them, hung out at festivals with some of them, that kind of thing. That's definitely one of the perks of creative adventures in festival communities is all the different connection points, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was playing at Infrasound, I think 2013, something like that, which is, for those not familiar, great electronic music festival in Wisconsin. And having grown up there, like it's kind of in my backwoods, and I knew a lot of the guys that promoted that festival from early on through the Twin Cities dubstep days, like Alex Toffler and Smilodon. So I was really excited to play there. And at the end of my sets at the time, what I've been doing is like, if it was the right context, getting everybody together and like having a group ohm at the very end of the set.
Yeah.
And at this particular set at Infrasound, I think it was one of the first years of the festival. It was just the right size crowd to actually get together, mostly in a really big circle and like all ohm together. So I actually came down from the stage. I walked in and like joined the circle, and we started sharing this group ohm. And as we were getting started, I started to hear these like tones emerge from the stage, which I had just walked off of and like, brought down my master and everything on, so it shouldn't have been making sound. But I look back and Ben Jordan, the flashbulb, is playing after me, and he's getting his gear set up and is starting to create a live ambient jam in perfect tune with the group ohm.
Nice.
So it was probably one of the most special ohms I've ever experienced, because the flashbulb just hopped in there.
He's like, I'm a jam with this.
Pitch perfect jam on top of that. And everybody, as they looked up on stage, realized what was happening and then got really excited. We all like applauded at the end because of his like extraordinary finesse and professionalism and musical ability to sort of like enhance that already special moment.
Nice.
Well,
so you gave some advice right before that story.
I don't know if I call it advice. I'm just
no, you did.
Off. All right,
but like I want something else. I want some more advice.
Okay.
Either for younger musicians or a younger version of you. What would you give on this like path of creativity?
Well, when you know something, you know it. When your ear or your eye picks up on something and it is like this holy object for you, you might feel like sometimes you're kind of chasing that dragon, but it's this innate part of, I think, our creative genesis is these like moments of eurekas, like when I listened to new age music on my parents' tape player on car trips when I was a kid, like with these like mostly synthetic environments, these like synth ambient washes and stuff like that. I loved listening to those from day one when I was a kid. Like the first moment I heard a synthesizer, I was very excited. I still am. So when you know. So I would say to myself then, like, keep trusting that, because at times I've wavered. I've kind of wondered, okay, should I be a musician at all? Should I be a folk musician? Should I maybe just completely change it up and like be a singer-songwriter or something? And if that's your thing, that's your thing.
Right.
and that it can't be extinguished, even if sometimes you try or it seems like the world is trying. It can't go out. That's my bias. But there have definitely been moments where I wanted to not have to spend time on music. I would just rather do something that makes money, or I would just rather do something that has some other directly impactful relationship with the world in a way that, maybe community, volunteering, stuff like that, which I'd still like to do more as I get older. But if it's a part of you, it's like, again, that thing that early on, you can't unknow it. It can't be unseen. It can't be unheard.
Right.
Whether you like it or not, and sometimes it's a curse as well as a blessing, to have that creative ember burning inside of you. But we have a responsibility to keep it fairly well nourished. It'll smolder, and sometimes just like a little puff of smoke will be coming up and nothing else. And not exactly a bonfire, but you can't snuff it out, actually. Some really silly analogy someone used a while ago was like, you have a pizza oven inside of you that will keep making pizzas, and sometimes they're like little pizzas, sometimes they're big. You might want to shut that oven off because you might get sick of it, but if it's there, it's there. So it's like a moment of self-recognition for me, was like understanding that it's just innately a part of me. I might not be the most famous musician. I might not be the most creative one, or like the best, or the most accomplished sound designer or audio engineer, but I can't get rid of it. So like, what's that journey look like for me then? Because it's just going to be a part of my life indefinitely. To my last breath, there will be something creative inside my soul just wanting to express itself. So how do you lend it a hand and give it the tools that it needs to thrive? And when it does, the rest of, I think, our spirit, our character gets illuminated by it, gets expanded by it.
Gets
excited, fulfilled. It's like that sense of being in love, like staying up all night with a special person. You don't necessarily always feel like you're in love with that creative part of yourself, but when you love it, it's existentially very satisfying and healing. And no one can tell you that you suck and actually make what you're doing suck. It can't happen. They can make you stop doing something for a while, or you might react to it and then go, okay, well, what's the point? I might not do this anymore. But it's not going to change the quality of that ember in you, ever. That's just how you choose to express it.
Beautiful. Evan, SkyTree, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew Norris, artsy as fuck. So.
Well, I just wanted to reiterate that you go by SkyTree, and that I'm really happy that you're on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really fun to just go more into the creative process with, I'm sure, your audience being a lot of artists and a lot of
mostly artists, I think.
A lot of creative people, not just in music. I'm often in podcast land just kind of like contextualizing creativity in music alone, or in peripheral elements of music. But
Mr. Bill has a podcast.
Yeah.
I like that one, even though I'm not a musician.
Yeah, I love that one too. He did an amazing podcast in the fallout with the Bass Nectar stuff last year with Mimi Page and Il Gates. Wonderful stuff. And actually, shout out to Mimi. We're going to be working on some stuff in the future. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with her a couple times in the past, and so far the plan is for her to basically be the first singer to have her voice routed through a quartz crystal filter.
Nice.
So I'm excited to demo that out pretty soon.
Hell yeah.
And build off of it.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, so everybody can find you where you at on the old interwebs.
So, like you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, Bandcamp is definitely the place if you feel like it. SkyTree.bandcamp.com. Because I have sole ownership over my creative content, it's all actually up for free and donation.
Nice.
I've just found that actually that tends to generate more revenue by letting people choose if they want to contribute or not. Kind of like the old In Rainbows, like Radiohead days.
Right.
It's worked pretty well. It's not bringing in bank, but it's nice to give people the opportunity to choose if they want to pay for it or not. So anything on there, feel free to just put in $0, listen to all of it. If you like it and you want to contribute, that's awesome. But Bandcamp is my like, community mechanism for people to listen, whether they have the funds or not, to buy something. But then also I'm on Twitter, SkyTree Music, and don't really use that much. Feel free to poke me there if you want me to post something more. But otherwise I use Instagram the most for just kind of updating what I've been working on. So like the things that Andrew and I were talking about earlier, I guess I don't have to refer to you in the third person. You're right here.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I don't ever refer to myself in the third person. Andrew never refers to himself.
or deals in absolutes. Yeah. Only Sith deal in absolutes. So Instagram is where I post updates on like the geosonification processes that I've worked on recently, so you can see like my early experiments in like getting oscilloscope to like show me the waveforms of tapping on a quartz crystal as output by the electrodes. I've done a few videos recently of my radioactivity experiments using gamma ray spectroscopy and Geiger counters as input sources for synthesis. The other one you mentioned, like using a creek with 2 electrodes put in the creek and the varying resistance of the water passing through it being the control voltage source into the synth to create generative music out of the creek. All that stuff is there. I have been putting some extended versions on YouTube. So SkyTree Music on YouTube is where you can find that. I'm not a YouTube content creator. I just put longer versions of Instagram stuff on it. And if there's more in the future to build off of, then I have a platform for it. But if anybody ever just wants to reach out to me direct, feel free to drop me a DM. I'm more than happy to discuss, more specifics if anybody has any questions or just wants to reach out. I try to keep off of social media actually these days, and remind my friends to text me and drop me a call even if they can, or stop by.
Well, thank you again, and thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for listening, guys.
Peace. Thank you again for listening to another episode of Artsy AF Podcast. If you are interested in supporting the Patreon, that address is patreon.com/ArtsyAF Podcast. And I want to thank all my patrons. You guys keep this engine running. I couldn't do it without you. Go over there and check out the tiers I have available. It includes video, guest suggestions, patron-only posts, and some merchandise. Thank you again for listening. Please rate, review, subscribe. Do all those little things that help get Artsy AF into the consciousness of more and more people. Shout.